I'm Judy Miller, and I'm a journalist, and I'm not going to ask a Shield Law question. You write about Facebook, and by the way, thank you very much for the book and for your work, but you write about Facebook, Google. I've spent the last year looking at the impact of those social media platforms on newspapers, and I can tell you that if the current trends continue, we won't have any newspapers left in a decade. You won't have to worry about whether or not the New York Times and the Washington Post are responsible, because they won't be there if things continue. You say that it's difficult, if not impossible, to or perhaps not advisable to regulate Facebook, Google through free speech laws or restrictions. But what about using antitrust laws, where it's no longer the government that journalists are afraid of in terms of restrictions, or primarily afraid of? It's being not even given a platform to have your articles and your ideas expressed, because Google and Facebook are very close to being in a monopolistic position to do just that, and have started to do that by limiting content which they find unacceptable. So should one explore the idea of using antitrust laws as opposed to getting at them through free speech? Why should Facebook not be regulated by the same defamation and libel laws that apply to the New York Times?
So big and important question. Jeff, do you want to go first? So first of all, I don't want to, I want to correct a misimpression. I did not take a position that Facebook should not be regulated. And I do have a sort of tentative position on this, but it's more complex than that. So we are in a period of absolutely profound historic transition in what we think of as, quote, journalism and the press, universities, and so on. I grew up in a family that worked at, owned a small daily newspaper in a small town in America. Spent my whole life in this arena. So I feel I know it well, and painfully well. It is a tragedy in America to see the decline of the press as we've known it. It's a tragedy. It's unclear exactly how it will play out. We know right now that private enterprise can't keep a major institution like the Washington Post going, and that the only way is to have it fall into the hands of a very, very, very wealthy person for whom the price of the paper is the equivalent of what his portfolio goes up or down in a single day. We know that local and regional press and journalism has been devastated by this. So the New York Times, Washington Post continue, but we know that there are so many examples of local newspapers. Meanwhile, we have this new technology, and they are deeply conflicted about how they want to be thought about. On the one hand, they want to be a utility. We just let everything out there. We're not responsible for anything. And Congress gave them that protection in the 1990s. On the other hand, they are under enormous pressure to censor, to stop. I mean, some people think they censor too much. Other people say you're not censoring enough. You're allowing Russians to meddle. You're allowing other people to spread work. So there's a criticism of too much censorship, a criticism of too little censorship, and a view that it's changing us. Not just that it's letting in a certain amount of speech and shouldn't be their choice. It's that we are becoming different people because of the interactions on this. So we're becoming more isolated in our exposure to other viewpoints. We're becoming short-term in our ability to think about things. These are of the most significant questions a country faces. It goes to the thought and the information we deal with. Many things to say about this. One of the reasons I raised the broadcasting example is because I think it's within the First Amendment tradition to conceive of a government role of participating in the development of these organizations. I'm not there yet because I still want to see how the technology companies themselves deal with this and change. I want to see them develop, if they can develop journalistic ethos in the way that the print media did and the broadcast media. I mean, when I was growing up, my father, who ran a newspaper, was a publisher, editor of a newspaper, would never accept the idea that a broadcaster was an editor or a journalist. I mean, it was unacceptable to have that. Then broadcasting developed that ethos over time. What will happen with Facebook and these other? Jeff says, rightly, we need to try some other things first, like education, like, I would add, we need to think about public funding of journalism. So I've written about, I mean, not one of the privileges of being an academic is you can come up with ideas that have absolutely no possibility of ever happening. And I think, you know, to take NPR and PBS and to develop our own American equivalent of BBC would be a fantastic thing. The journalism school, as you know, and Nick Lemon, Nick likes to say that he and I are the only human beings in the United States who have advocated for public funding of classic journalism. But most journalists regard that as anathema, just like most politicians do. Jeff?
Just 2 quick points. I mean, one is I do think that the idea of public funding is increasingly important and attractive going forward. But it has to be done in a very careful way. Because once again, if the government has the power to fund journalism, then the danger is that whoever's got the power to decide who they're going to fund, they're going to do it in ways that are politically and ideologically consistent with their own views. So one has to figure out how to do that in a way that's truly neutral. That's not impossible, but it's a serious challenge. The second point I guess I'd make is that one way to deal in part with some of the problems about Facebook or other social media in terms of government regulation is to have government, for example, require that whenever an individual reads a site or on social media of a particular ideological point of view, that they are automatically then given an alternative, opposite position. It's kind of like a fairness doctrine to the individual, so that at least people are automatically given the opposing view. Now, they don't have to read it. You can't require them to read it, but at least to make sure they're aware of it and they see it, and you can do that with these algorithms. And I think that's one way of enhancing the opportunities that people have to not become completely tribal in their social media activity.
I mean, let me just say one other thing. So easy to convey the wrong impression. I think it's fantastic what has happened to the Washington Post under its new ownership. I mean, Don Graham and the Graham family are legends in the journalistic field and should be legends in how that transition happened. But the strengthening of the Washington Post is one of the great stories of the past decade, I think.